Imagine, if you will, the Nile in the earliest hours of morning, when the world is still wrapped in the soft blue darkness before dawn. The water moves as it has moved for countless centuries, carrying with it the whispers of 1,000 years, the dreams of dynasties that rose like the sun and faded like evening stars. This is Egypt, not the Egypt of battles and conquest, but the Egypt of quiet temples and patient scribes, of farmers watching the rivers rise, of priests who lit incense in the hour before the world awoke. Here, along this ancient waterway, the concept of the God-King was born, not through thunder and proclamation, but through the slow accumulation of belief, like silt depositing itself along the riverbank, season after season, building something permanent from something carried on the current. Picture the valley as it might have appeared 3,000 years before the Common Era. The desert stretched endlessly on either side, golden and silent, holding its breath beneath stars that seemed closer then, more watchful. And between those walls of sand, the river created a ribbon of impossible green papyrus swaying in the pre-dawn breeze. Date palms dark against the slowly brightening sky. Fields of barley that would feed a civilization that believed itself eternal. In those early morning hours, before the heat of day transformed the landscape into something shimmering and dreamlike, you might have seen the farmers already at work. They moved through the mist that rose from the water, their movements unhurried, connected to rhythms older than memory. They spoke little, these men and women who fed an empire. What was there to say that the river had not already whispered to them, generation after generation? The villages along the Nile were small then, clusters of mud-brick homes that seemed to grow naturally from the earth itself. Smoke from cooking fires drifted upward in lazy spirals, carrying the scent of bread baking, of life continuing as it had continued for so long that no one could remember when it had begun. Children would wake soon, their voices would fill the morning air. But for now, there was only this profound quiet, this sense of time suspended between darkness and day. And somewhere, in one of these villages, or perhaps in a settlement grander than the others, there lived a man who would change everything. We call him Menes, though his true name has been lost to the centuries, like so many other things, like languages spoken in whispers, like songs that no one remembers how to sing. He was, they say, the first to understand that leadership was not merely about strength or wisdom or even divine blessing, but about becoming something more than human, about transforming oneself into a bridge between the mortal world and something vast and incomprehensible. The white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, these had existed separately, worn by men who governed through force of will and fortunate birth. But Menes saw something different in these symbols. He saw not division, but potential unity, not to crowns, but the beginning of something that had never existed before. A double crown that would represent not just political unity, but cosmic order itself. How quiet that moment must have been, when he first placed both crowns upon his head. There were no cheering crowds, perhaps no great ceremony, not yet. Just a man standing in the half-light of dawn, understanding that he was about to become something his ancestors could not have imagined. A living God. Not a representative of the gods, not a priest who spoke for them, but a deity himself, walking among mortals, carrying within his human form the essence of divine authority. The Nile continued its eternal flow. The farmers continued their work. The sun rose, as it always had, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. But something fundamental had shifted. Some invisible boundary had been crossed. And though most people would not understand it for years or generations to come, the world had changed. Divine kingship had been born along these quiet riverbanks, and it would shape not just Egypt, but the very concept of civilization itself. For the next 3,000 years, as the morning light strengthened, touching the water with fingers of brightness, as the mist began to burn away and the day's heat began its slow ascent, the villagers awakened fully. Life continued, ordinary and extraordinary at once, beneath a sky that had witnessed the birth of something timeless, the idea that a human being could be transformed through ritual and belief and the mysterious alchemy of faith into a vessel for eternal truth. And if you listen carefully, in the quiet hours of your own night, you can almost hear it still, that ancient moment when everything changed and nothing changed. When the river flowed and a man became a god. When the first pharaoh looked out across his realm and understood both the terrible weight and the profound beauty of what he had become in those earliest days of unified Egypt, before the great pyramids rose to pierce the sky, before the Valley of Kings became a sacred necropolis, there lived people whose names we will never know. They are the ones who truly made divine kingship possible, not through grand gestures or heroic deeds, but through the simple act of belief, sustained day after day, year after year, until it became as natural as breathing. Consider the scribe, perhaps, who sat in a small room in Memphis, the city Menes had chosen as his capital. His name is lost to us, this man who spent his days pressing reed pen to papyrus, recording grain shipments and tax collections, births and deaths, the ordinary details that make a kingdom function. His hands were stained with ink, his back perpetually aching from hours bent over his work. He had studied for years to master the complex hieroglyphic script, learning not just to write, but to understand the sacred nature of written words, how they could make temporary things permanent, how they could preserve a moment beyond the lifetime of those who lived it. He believed in the divine nature of his pharaoh, not because he had witnessed miracles or heard the voice of gods, but because this belief gave order to his world, structure to his days. When he wrote the pharaoh's name, he did so with a reverence that transformed administrative duty into spiritual practice. The cartouche that enclosed the royal name became, through his careful strokes, a sacred space where divinity and humanity met on papyrus, where the eternal touched the everyday. And there was the priestess, perhaps, who served in a small temple dedicated to Hathor, goddess of love and joy and music. She rose before dawn, as priests and priestesses had always done, to perform the morning rituals that welcomed the sun god Ra on his daily journey across the sky. But she also prayed for the pharaoh, this living Horus who walked among them. She prayed that his divine essence would remain strong, that the cosmic order he represented would hold, that the balance between chaos and harmony would tip toward light. Her prayers were not elaborate. She was not a high priestess, not someone who spoke directly with the God King or performed ceremonies in his presence. She was ordinary, one of hundreds who served in small temples throughout the kingdom, maintaining the spiritual infrastructure that supported divine kingship. Her prayers were whispered, simple requests for continuity and peace, for the river to flood at the right time, for her family to remain healthy, for the pharaoh to continue being what he had become, a bridge to the divine that made their world comprehensible. Think of the stonemason, his muscles corded from years of labor, his hands rough from handling the granite and limestone that would become temples and monuments. He worked on a construction project commissioned by the pharaoh, perhaps a shrine, perhaps an administrative building, perhaps something whose purpose he only dimly understood. But he took pride in his work, in the precision of each stone fitted against its neighbor, in the smooth surfaces his tools could create from rough rock when he shaped these stones. He was not merely following orders or earning his daily bread and beer. He was participating in something larger than himself, contributing to the physical manifestation of divine order. Each stone he cut became part of the permanent record of his Pharaoh's reign, proof that divine kingship could transform not just hearts and minds, but the very landscape itself. His hands, scarred and calloused, were instruments through which cosmic will became earthly reality. And there were the farmers, of course always the farmers, whose labor fed everyone else, whose relationship with the land and the river made civilization possible. They rose with the sun and worked until darkness made further labor impossible. They knew the feel of rich Nile silt between their fingers, understood the subtle signs that predicted the river's annual flood, could read the sky for weather and the fields for the right moment to plant or harvest. They spoke little of the Pharaoh in their daily conversations. Their concerns were more immediate. Would the flood come at the right time? Would the harvest be sufficient? Would their children thrive? But when they paid their taxes, delivering grain to the royal storehouses, they did so knowing that this grain would support not just the royal household, but the entire system that protected them, that maintained the irrigation canals, that ensured justice was administered and borders were defended. The Pharaoh's divinity was, for them, less a theological concept than a lived reality. His cosmic authority was what stood between them and chaos, between order and the breakdown of everything that made their lives possible. They did not need to understand the complex rituals performed in distant temples or the intricate theological debates that occupied learned priests. They needed only to trust that the divine king was fulfilling his cosmic responsibilities, and that trust was given quietly, without fanfare, as naturally as they gave trust to the river itself. There were mothers who held their children at night, telling stories of the gods and goddesses, stories in which the Pharaoh sometimes appeared as a hero, sometimes as a distant figure of awesome power. These children would grow up accepting divine kingship as naturally as they accepted the sunrise, the river's flow, the changing of seasons. For them, there had never been and could never be a world without a god-king at its center. There were merchants who traveled the river, bringing goods from one nome to another, from the delta to Upper Egypt and back again. They saw different regions, different customs, different local deities worshipped with varying intensity. But everywhere they went, the Pharaoh's authority was acknowledged. His image appeared on monuments and walls. His names were spoken with the same reverent care. This unity in diversity, this common thread that ran through all the variations of Egyptian life, was itself a testament to the power of divine kingship to create cohesion from difference. And there were the elderly, who remembered earlier times, who could compare the present with the past and find in that comparison reasons for gratitude or concern. They had seen pharaohs come and go, had witnessed the transfer of divine essence from one ruler to the next, had observed how the kingdom continued even as individual god-kings returned to the earth. Their memories became a kind of living archive, a way of understanding that divine kingship was larger than any single pharaoh, that it was an institution that transcended individual mortality while depending entirely on the accumulated faith of millions of ordinary people. None of these people were heroes. They did not perform great deeds that would be recorded on temple walls or celebrated in royal inscriptions. Their names have vanished completely, dissolved into time like salt into water. But they were the true foundation of divine kingship. The countless individuals whose daily acceptance and support made it possible for one man to claim divinity and have that claim accepted. Believed, sustained across 1,000 years as night falls over their vanished world. As we imagine their lives from the distance of millennia, we can almost sense their presence, not as individuals, but as a collective breath, a shared understanding that gave shape and substance to one of humanity's most enduring experiments in sacred governance. They sleep now, these people of the two lands, beneath the sands that have covered their homes and fields, their temples and workshops. But their legacy remains, written not in stone, but in the fact that we still remember, still wonder, still find ourselves drawn to the mystery of a civilization that believed its kings were gods. The Egypt of the god-kings was a world of profound contrasts, where the harshest desert on earth pressed against the most fertile river valley, where brutal heat gave way to cool evenings of remarkable gentleness, where the eternal and the ephemeral existed in such close proximity that the boundary between them sometimes seemed to disappear entirely. Stand, for a moment, at the edge of the cultivation, where the green fields end and the desert begins. The transition is shockingly abrupt. One step and you are in life, surrounded by crops and trees, and the sound of water moving through irrigation channels. Another step and you are in silence and emptiness, in a landscape that could swallow civilizations whole and leave no trace of their passing. This boundary, this knife edge between fertility and barrenness, shaped the Egyptian understanding of order and chaos, of the fragile nature of civilization and the constant vigilance required to maintain it. The Nile itself was the great mystery and the great certainty. Every year, with a reliability that seemed miraculous, the river would rise, covering the fields with water that carried precious silt from the highlands of distant Africa. The ancient Egyptians did not fully understand why this happened. They knew only that it did happen, that this annual gift made their entire civilization possible, and that the Pharaoh's divine authority was somehow connected to this cosmic rhythm. Imagine standing on the riverbank in the weeks before the inundation, watching the water begin its slow rise. There was a quality to the light then, a particular slant of sun through dust that painted everything in shades of amber and gold. The farmers would watch anxiously, looking for signs that the flood would be sufficient, not too high, which would destroy villages and drown fields, not too low, which would mean hunger and hardship. The priests would perform their rituals, and the pharaoh would conduct ceremonies meant to ensure the proper balance. And then the water would come, spreading across the land like a blessing, like proof that divine order still held. During the inundation, when the fields lay beneath water and agricultural work was impossible, Egypt transformed. The farmers became builders and craftsmen, working on the pharaoh's construction projects, contributing their labor to the creation of monuments that would outlast them by thousands of years. This was not slavery, not in the brutal sense we might imagine, but a form of civic duty, a way of giving back to the system that protected and fed them. They were housed and fed well during these months, their work supervised by scribes who tracked every detail, and there was a pride in what they created, a sense of participating in something larger than their individual lives. The villages where these people lived were modest, the houses built from mud bricks that returned to earth with each generation, rebuilt by children on the foundations laid by parents. The rooms were small and dim, offering refuge from the intense heat of midday. Life happened outside, in courtyards where women ground grain and baked bread, where children played games whose rules have been forgotten, where neighbors gathered in the evening to share news and stories and the companionable silence of people who know each other well. The cities were different. Of course, Memphis, Thebes, and later others. Centers of administration and religion where the presence of divine authority was more palpable. Here stood temples of stone, built to last forever. Their walls covered with reliefs showing the pharaoh in the presence of gods, performing rituals, receiving divine endorsement. Here were the palaces where the god-king lived when he was not traveling his kingdom, where the daily routines of royalty were carried out with a ceremonial precision that transformed every act into religious observance. But even the cities maintained a certain quietness, a sense of order and routine that might surprise those who imagine ancient civilizations as places of constant drama and upheaval. Most days were ordinary. The sun rose, people went about their work, children learned from their elders. Disputes were settled, meals were prepared and shared. The pharaoh's divine authority provided the framework within which all this ordinary life could unfold, the invisible architecture that held society together. The temples were perhaps the most extraordinary spaces in this world, places where the boundary between human and divine became permeable, where carefully maintained rituals created environments in which the gods could be approached, honored, petitioned. The innermost sanctuaries were dark and mysterious, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls covered with sacred images. The scent of incense hung in the air, mixing with the aroma of offerings, bread and beer and wine, fruits and flowers. Everything that sustained life offered back to the powers that made life possible. Only priests could enter these inner spaces. For ordinary Egyptians, religion was experienced in the outer courtyards during festivals when the god's statue would be brought out in procession, carried on the shoulders of priests while crowds watched and celebrated. These festivals broke the routine of daily life, providing moments of collective joy and spiritual connection that reinforced the social bonds. Holding communities together, the landscape itself carried memories. Ancient cemeteries where generations of ancestors lay buried became part of the spiritual geography, reminding the living of continuity, of belonging to something that extended backward and forward in time. The tombs of pharaohs and nobles grew more elaborate over the centuries, but even modest graves received offerings. Flowers and food left for the dead who were not truly gone but had merely transitioned to another form of existence. Night. The Egyptian world transformed once more. Oil lamps flickered in homes and temples, creating small islands of light in vast darkness. The stars blazed overhead with a clarity we can barely imagine now, our modern skies washed pale by artificial light. The ancient Egyptians knew these stars intimately, saw in their patterns the forms of gods and goddesses, charted their movements as carefully as they tracked the Nile's rise and fall. Time itself seemed different then, measured not by mechanical precision but by natural rhythms, the sun's journey, the moon's phases, the river's cycle, the turning of the agricultural year, and always, underlying everything, was the desert silence. Step away from the river, away from the villages and cities, and you entered a world of such profound quiet that you could hear your own heartbeat, your own breath. This silence was not empty, but full of the absence of things, of the space where life was not, where the ordered world gave way to something vast and indifferent. The Egyptians built their civilization against this silence, created their divine kingship as a bulwark against the chaos that waited patiently at the edges of the green valley, and in the act of that creation, made something beautiful and fragile and enduring. Time, in ancient Egypt, did not march forward with the relentless linearity we experience today. It moved in circles and spirals in the daily cycle of Ra's sunboat crossing the sky, in the annual renewal of the Nile's flood, in the succession of pharaohs who were both different individuals and the same eternal Horus, dying and being reborn again and again in human form. The first pharaohs gave way to their successors, and those successors to their heirs, and gradually, imperceptibly at first, the nature of divine kingship began to evolve, not through dramatic breaks or revolutions, but through the slow accumulation of small changes, like the silt depositing itself along the riverbanks, building new ground one invisible layer at a time. The pyramids rose, first stepped, then smooth-sided, reaching always upward toward the sky that was the domain of the gods. Each pharaoh sought to create his eternal dwelling, his bridge between earthly life and divine existence after death. The construction of these monuments organized Egyptian society in new ways, required innovations in mathematics and engineering, created generations of skilled workers who passed their knowledge to apprentices who would outlive them. But as the pyramids grew more magnificent, as royal power seemed to reach its absolute zenith, subtle shifts were occurring beneath the surface of divine certainty. Provincial governors, appointed by the pharaohs to administer distant nomes, began to establish their own dynasties, their positions passing from father to son. They remained loyal, still acknowledged the god-king's supreme authority, but they also developed local power bases, local identities, local ways of doing things that did not always align perfectly with royal preferences. The priests, too, were changing. The temples accumulated wealth through royal donations and private offerings. The religious bureaucracy grew more complex, more specialized. Priests developed their own hierarchies, their own ways of interpreting sacred traditions. They remained devoted to the pharaoh's divine nature, but they also became guardians of knowledge and ritual that existed somewhat independently of royal authority. These were not rebellions or challenges to the established order. They were simply the natural evolution of a civilization growing more complex, more layered, more difficult for any single authority, even a divine one, to control absolutely. The Egyptians themselves might not have recognized these changes as they happened. Change is like that, occurring so gradually that those living through it often perceive only continuity, only the eternal sameness of the way things have always been. The Old Kingdom, that age of pyramid builders and absolute divine authority, did not end with a catastrophic collapse, but with a kind of slow dissolution, like salt dissolving in water. The pharaohs of the 6th dynasty ruled for shorter periods, died leaving unclear successions, struggled to maintain the comprehensive control their ancestors had wielded with such apparent ease. And when the central authority finally fragmented during the first intermediate period, it happened almost gently, without the violent upheavals we might expect. Egypt did not fall apart so much as it distributed itself, power flowing outward, from the center to the provinces like the Nile spreading across its floodplain. Local governors became local rulers, maintaining the forms and titles of pharaonic authority even as they governed independently. The idea of divine kingship survived because it was too deeply embedded in Egyptian consciousness to disappear. But it existed in multiple places simultaneously, each local ruler claiming to embody the eternal principle in his own region. This period is often described as a dark age, a time of chaos and decline. But for many Egyptians living through it, life may not have seemed so different. The sun still rose, the river still flooded, fields were still planted and harvested, justice was still administered, though now by local authorities rather than distant pharaohs. Perhaps there was less monumental construction, fewer resources devoted to projects that glorified royal divinity. But the rhythms of ordinary life continued, persistent and patient. The reunification under the Middle Kingdom pharaohs brought divine kingship back to the center, but it returned changed, chastened by the experience of fragmentation. The new pharaohs were no less divine, but their divinity was expressed differently, less distant and absolute, more concerned with actively demonstrating care for their subjects, with accessible justice and practical administration. They still built pyramids, still performed the sacred rituals, but they also wrote instructions on kingship, reflections on the responsibilities of power that suggested a more conscious, more philosophical approach to divine rule. And then, after centuries of renewed stability, change came again, this time from outside. As the Hyksos arrived from the northeast, bringing new military technologies and establishing their rule over northern Egypt. This foreign domination challenged the very concept of pharaonic divinity in ways the first intermediate period had not. How could divine kingship be authentic if foreign rulers could successfully claim it? How could cosmic order be maintained when the traditional patterns of authority were so thoroughly disrupted? Yet again, the institution proved more resilient than we might expect. The Theban rulers in the south maintained their claim to divine authority, kept alive the traditions and rituals, preserved the essential idea even as its earthly manifestation was contested. And when they eventually expelled the Hyksos and Egypt under the new kingdom, divine kingship emerged, transformed once more, now imperial, militaristic, more explicitly focused on power projection and territorial expansion than on the internal cosmic balance that had preoccupied earlier pharaohs. Through all these changes, the Nile continued its eternal flow. The farmers continued working their fields, trusting that the flood would come, that life would continue. The scribes continued recording, the priests continued performing their rituals, the craftsmen continued creating. The underlying continuity of Egyptian civilization was maintained not through political stability, which came and went, but through these daily repetitions, these ordinary acts of faith and labor that constituted the real substance of divine kingship's support. The gods themselves seemed unchanging, their images on temple walls always the same, their stories repeated without variation. But the relationship between these gods and their human representative, the pharaoh, was constantly evolving in subtle ways that accumulated across generations into fundamental shifts in how divine authority was understood and exercised. And perhaps this is the deepest truth about divine kingship, that it survived for so long, not because it remained rigidly unchanging, but because it was flexible enough to adapt, to incorporate new realities while maintaining its essential claim to provide order and meaning to human existence. Like the river itself, it flowed onward, sometimes swift and sometimes slow, sometimes clear and sometimes turbulent, but always moving, always continuing, always both the same and different from moment to moment, year to year, dynasty to dynasty. As the centuries accumulated, as dynasty gave way to dynasty and the pharaohs' names grew longer and more elaborate, there emerged a peculiar burden and blessing, the weight of memory, the necessity of remembering who had come before, what they had accomplished, how they connected to the eternal pattern of divine kingship. The scribes became, in many ways, the true guardians of pharaonic continuity. Generation after generation of them sat in their schools, learning the complex hieroglyphic script, copying ancient texts until their fingers ached and their eyes strained in the lamplight. They created king lists, careful chronologies that connected each pharaoh to his predecessors in an unbroken chain stretching back to Menes, the first unifier, and beyond him to the gods themselves who had ruled Egypt in the mythological time before human history began. These lists were not merely administrative records, but sacred genealogies, proof that divine kingship was eternal even though individual pharaohs were mortal. When a new pharaoh ascended the throne, these lists assured everyone that he was not an innovation or an accident, but the latest manifestation of something timeless, predetermined, cosmically ordained. But memory is a strange thing. The farther back in time the scribes reached, the more the individual pharaohs blurred together into archetypes: the pyramid builders, the warrior kings, the wise administrators, the specific details of their reigns, the particular challenges they faced, the unique qualities they possessed as individuals faded away, leaving only the formal titles and the monumental accomplishments, the things deemed worthy of eternal remembrance. Some pharaohs were deliberately erased from memory, their names chiseled away from monuments, their cartouches defaced, their very existence denied by successors who deemed them heretical or illegitimate. This act of erasure, damnatio memoria, reveals how deeply the Egyptians understood that memory was power, that to be forgotten was a kind of second death, perhaps more final than physical mortality. Yet even these erased pharaohs left traces, empty spaces on king lists that suggested missing entries, archaeological evidence that contradicted official histories, whispered stories that persisted despite official silence. Memory, it turned out, was more stubborn than anyone had anticipated, refusing to be completely controlled even by divine authority. The priests, too, were memory keepers, but of a different sort. They preserved the sacred rituals, the proper procedures for approaching the gods, the correct words to speak and actions to perform in the temple's inner sanctuaries. This knowledge passed from master to apprentice in an unbroken chain that stretched back through time until its origins were lost in the mists of antiquity, as rituals were repeated day after day, year after year, century after century. They acquired a kind of weight, an accumulated spiritual force that came from being performed in the same way by countless generations. The priests understood themselves not as innovators but as preservers, maintaining exactly what had been handed down to them, refusing any alteration that might break the sacred connection to the past. But of course, subtle changes did creep in. A word would be mispronounced, and the mispronunciation would be taught to the next generation as the correct form. A ritual gesture would be slightly modified, and that modification would become traditional. Memory, even sacred memory, was never as fixed and perfect as those who maintained it believed. The monuments themselves became a kind of memory, stone inscriptions speaking to the future about pharaohs long dead. The pyramids brooded over the landscape, enigmatic and eternal. Their original white limestone casing stones long since stripped away, but their massive cores still standing, still proclaiming the power and ambition of the god-kings who had commanded their construction. Travelers from later ages would stand before these monuments and wonder at the civilization that had created them. They would read the hieroglyphic inscriptions, or try to, once the knowledge of how to read them had been lost, and construct their own interpretations of what divine kingship had meant, often projecting their own concerns and assumptions onto the ancient past. For the ordinary, Egyptians of the Middle and New Kingdoms. The earlier pharaohs existed in a kind of mythical time. Not quite historical figures, but not quite gods either. Stories were told about them, some perhaps based on actual events, others pure invention, all blended together into a collective memory that served not to accurately preserve the past, but to make sense of the present by connecting it to something older and more authoritative. An ancestor cult developed, with later pharaohs making offerings at the tombs of their predecessors, claiming connection to the achievements and legitimacy of earlier rulers. This was not mere ancestor worship, but a sophisticated understanding that divine kingship existed across time, that each pharaoh was simultaneously an individual and a link in an eternal chain. The aged, sitting in the evening with their grandchildren, would tell stories of pharaohs from their youth, and their grandchildren would someday tell those same stories to their own grandchildren. And in this way memory was transmitted not just through official channels, but through the intimate repetitions of family life, through the stories that made sense of who they were and where they came from. But memory is also forgetting. For every pharaoh remembered, dozens were forgotten. For every monument that survived, hundreds crumbled into dust. For every text carefully preserved, countless others were lost to fire and flood and the simple deterioration of papyrus and leather and wood. What remained was a highly selective memory, shaped by who had power to create monuments and texts, by what later generations deemed important enough to preserve, by the accidents of archaeology that determine what survives to be discovered and what disappears forever. The divine kingship we remember is not necessarily the divine kingship that was, but rather the divine kingship that left the most durable traces, that had the loudest voice speaking across the centuries. And yet, paradoxically, this incomplete and selective memory preserved something essential: the understanding that human beings had once believed it possible for a mortal to become divine, had built an entire civilization on that belief, and had sustained it for longer than most nations have existed. This knowledge, however fragmentary, speaks across millennia with a power that transcends its own. Incompleteness. As we drift deeper into sleep, these ancient voices of memory grow fainter, more distant, like echoes in a vast stone chamber, repeating and repeating until we can no longer distinguish the original sound from its reflections, until past and present blur together in the twilight of consciousness, until we too become part of the great forgetting and remembering that makes us human. In the Valley of the Kings, the sun beats down on stone that has forgotten its purpose. The tombs lie empty now, their treasures looted in antiquity or carried away to museums in distant lands. The hieroglyphs on the walls still speak, but in a language few can read, telling stories of journeys through the underworld, of transformations and trials, of the pharaoh's eternal struggle to maintain cosmic order even after death. Walk through these silent valleys in the hour before sunset, when the light turns golden and the shadows grow long, and you can almost feel the weight of vanished centuries. The tourists who visit during the day have departed. The heat is beginning to release its grip. There is only stone and silence and the sense of something that was once magnificent now, reduced to absence. These tombs were hidden, carefully concealed in desert cliffs, protected by geography and secrecy and religious awe. Yet they were found, opened, emptied. The divine bodies of god-kings were disturbed from their eternal rest, their linen wrappings unraveled, their mummified faces exposed to air and light they were never meant to encounter again. The treasures buried with them, gold and jewelry, furniture and clothing, the beautiful, useless things meant to serve them in the afterlife, scattered across the world, become exhibits behind glass. Labels explaining provenance and historical context, but silent about the faith that created them. The temples to stand in their various states of preservation and ruin. Karnak, vast and maze-like. Its hypostyle hall still capable of inspiring awe with columns thick as houses reaching toward the sky. Luxor, graceful and more compact. Its obelisk lonely now that its twin stands in Paris. Another displacement. Another piece of Egypt existing out of context at these sites. Archaeologists work with careful patience, measuring and recording, attempting to reconstruct not just the physical structures, but the meanings they once held. They dust away sand, grain by grain, photograph fallen stones, debate interpretations of damaged inscriptions. Their work is meticulous, scientific, devoted to truth as they can best determine it. But something ineffable is lost. The lived experience, the emotional reality of divine kingship when it was not history but present tense. When the pharaoh was not a museum exhibit but a living presence that organized society and gave meaning to existence. The museums hold fragments, statues with broken noses, papyrus scrolls yellowed and brittle, jewelry that once adorned royal bodies, scarabs and amulets and figurines. Each object is carefully labeled, dated, explained. Together they tell a story, or rather many stories, about ancient Egypt and its divine kings. But they tell these stories in whispers, in a language of objects separated from the world that created them. Sometimes restoration work reveals layers of history, plaster covering earlier inscriptions. New construction built atop older foundations. Evidence of the constant reuse and modification that characterized Egyptian building practices. These layers speak to the continuity that was so important to the pharaohs. The sense that they were not creating something new, but maintaining something eternal. Yet they also reveal the changes, the way each age adapted what it inherited, making the past serve present purposes. In Cairo's Egyptian Museum, in the British Museum, in the Louvre and the Metropolitan Museum, and 100 other institutions, the relics of divine kingship are scattered like pieces of a vast puzzle that can never be completely reassembled. Scholars connect them, trace relationships, build theories about what it all meant. But there is always more that is unknown than known. More questions than answers, more silence than speech. The Rosetta Stone, that fragment of a decree that finally unlocked the secrets of hieroglyphic writing, stands as a testament both to memory and forgetting. For over 1,000 years, the script was unreadable, the voices of the pharaohs silent, their inscriptions reduced to mysterious decoration. Then, suddenly, they could speak again, or rather, modern scholars could hear them, could read their proclamations and prayers and claims to divinity. But what was recovered was still incomplete. The everyday speech of ordinary Egyptians, the vernacular that was never written down, remains largely lost. The nuances of religious belief, the emotional textures of faith and doubt, the personal experiences that can never be reduced to formal inscriptions, these persist only as absence, as questions we can ask but never fully answer. Sometimes archaeological discoveries still surprise us. A new tomb is found, or an old one reveals previously unknown chambers. Ancient texts thought lost turn up in monastery libraries or private collections. Each discovery adds detail to our understanding, fills in gaps in the historical record. Yet each also reveals how much more we don't know, how vast the silence is compared to the fragments of voice that survive. the pyramids remain. Of course, those massive survivors that outlasted dynasty after dynasty, that stood ancient already when Greek tourists came to marvel at them, that continue standing now. They are the most visible legacy of divine kingship, proof in stone that something extraordinary existed here, that human beings were capable of mobilizing vast resources and sophisticated knowledge to create monuments that still inspire awe. But even the pyramids raise more questions than they answer. How exactly were they built? What specific religious beliefs motivated their construction? How did the workers who built them understand their labor as obligation, as devotion, as both? The stones themselves cannot speak to these questions. They stand mute, magnificent, enigmatic, in the villages along the Nile, in places where farmers still work fields that have been cultivated for thousands of years. There is sometimes a sense of continuity with the pharaonic past. Ancient irrigation systems are still used, modified and maintained, but fundamentally unchanged. Local festivals sometimes echo ancient celebrations. Their religious content transformed, but their social function similar. But even here, the connection is tenuous, more imagined than real. A longing for continuity rather than its genuine survival. Divine kingship as a living institution is utterly gone. No one believes anymore that a human being can truly be a god. The intellectual framework that made such belief possible has dissolved, replaced by other ways of understanding power and authority, other systems for organizing society and making sense of existence. We can study divine kingship, analyze it, attempt to understand it, but we cannot recreate the lived experience of believing in it, of organizing our entire world around that belief, and perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps some things are meant to be lost, to exist only as memory and speculation, as fragments that speak of wholeness without ever allowing us to fully grasp it. The dust of dynasties settles over everything, gently erasing details, slowly returning magnificent achievements to the earth from which they came, teaching the fundamental lesson that all things pass, all certainties dissolve, all empires become stories whispered in the darkness before sleep. There is something profoundly peaceful about contemplating a civilization that believed itself eternal but proved, like all things, to be temporary. The pharaohs ruled for 3,000 years, an almost incomprehensible span of time, longer than the entire history of Christianity, longer than most languages have existed, longer than the oldest living trees have been growing, and yet it ended. Divine kingship, which seemed as permanent as the sun's rising, eventually ceased to be. This is not a story of failure. It is simply the way of things. Everything that begins also ends. Every civilization that rises also falls. Every certainty eventually dissolves into uncertainty. Every stone monument, no matter how massive, will eventually return to dust. This is not tragedy, but rather the fundamental nature of existence in time. The price paid for the privilege of having existed at all. The pharaohs understood this, perhaps better than we do. Their tombs, their mummies, their elaborate preparations for the afterlife all testify to an awareness that earthly existence was temporary. That divine kingship in the here and now was only one form of a greater cosmic order that extended beyond death into eternity. They built for permanence, but also accepted transformation, trusted that while specific forms would change, essential patterns would continue. When we look at their ruins, we see endings, but perhaps they would see transitions, transformations from one state to another, which is not the same as cessation. The god-king dies, but becomes Osiris in the underworld. The earthly kingdom transforms, but the cosmic principles it embodied continue. Nothing is truly lost, only changed. Moved from visible to invisible, from material to spiritual, from presence to memory, this perspective offers a certain consolation as we face our own mortalities, our own awareness that everything we build and believe and hold dear will eventually pass away. If even divine kingship, that most stable and enduring of human institutions, could not last forever, then surely we should not expect permanence from anything we create. This is not cause for despair, but for a kind of gentle acceptance, a recognition that impermanence is not a flaw, but a feature of existence. The Egyptians' belief in eternal life after death now seems quaint to many, a superstition born of fear and hope. But perhaps they understood something important, that meaning and purpose do not require literal permanence, that something can be valuable and true without lasting forever. Their faith in divine kingship sustained their civilization for millennia, enabled extraordinary achievements, created art and architecture of sublime beauty. That it eventually ended does not retroactively invalidate what it was while it existed. We modern people often struggle with this. We want our achievements to last, our beliefs to be vindicated, our civilizations to endure indefinitely. We resist the idea that everything we build will someday be ruins, that our most cherished certainties will eventually seem as strange to future generations as divine kingship seems to us. But resistance changes nothing. The river flows, the seasons turn. Empires rise and fall according to patterns larger than any individual will or collective effort can alter. There is freedom in accepting this. If nothing lasts forever anyway, then we can stop worrying about creating permanence and focus instead on creating beauty, meaning, and connection in the time we have. The pharaohs built pyramids knowing they would die. The priests performed rituals knowing civilizations eventually fall. The scribes recorded history knowing that records themselves decay and are lost. Yet they did these things anyway, found purpose and meaning in the doing, rather than in any guarantee of eternal success. Perhaps this is divine kingship's final gift to us, this lesson in this reminder that temporary does not mean meaningless. The pharaohs are gone, but they existed. Their civilization has ended, but it was. The faith that sustained them seems strange to us now, but it was real to them, as real as anything has ever been. And in the end, what more can we ask than to have existed fully in our time? To have created something beautiful even knowing it will not last? To have found meaning in patterns that transcend individual mortality even as they themselves are temporary? The stars that the ancient Egyptians navigated by still shine, but the civilization that mapped them is dust. The Nile still flows, but the divine kings who claimed to control its flood are forgotten names on weathered stones. This is not sad, exactly. It simply is. And in that simple fact lies a kind of peace, an acceptance that to exist at all is miracle enough, that permanence was never the point, that every ending is also a completion as you drift towards sleep. Imagine the Nile at twilight, its waters reflecting the last light of day, moving steadily onward toward a sea it will never reach because it is constantly evaporating, returning to the sky to fall again as rain, flowing forever even as each particular drop of water exists only briefly before transforming into something else. This is the rhythm of everything, constant transformation, eternal patterns expressed through temporary forms, continuity that depends on change rather than resisting it. Divine kingship, like the river's water, has returned to the sky. But the pattern it expressed, the human longing for order, meaning, and connection to something greater than ourselves, flows onward, expressing itself in new forms, new civilizations, new ways of understanding and organizing our place in the cosmos. Nothing is ever really lost. Everything transforms, and in that transformation lies not tragedy, but the beautiful, terrible, peaceful truth of existence in time. Night has fully fallen now over the Nile Valley. The tourists have departed. The archaeologists have put away their tools. The museum guards walk their rounds through galleries where Pharaohs' statues stand in spotlit silence. In the desert, stars multiply overhead in their ancient patterns. The same stars that washed the pyramid builders at their work, that guided the priests in their calculations, that seemed to the pharaohs like distant souls of the righteous dead, transfigured and eternal. The monuments sleep, if stones can sleep. The temples, half ruined, hold their silence. The tombs, empty of their royal occupants, wait in darkness that is almost absolute. Even the Nile seems quieter at night, its eternal flow continuing, but somehow gentler, less insistent. A whisper rather than a declaration in this darkness. In this deep night silence, the distance between ancient and modern collapses. The pharaohs sleep beneath the sand, their divine pretensions return to dust, their elaborate theologies dissolved into uncertainty. But they sleep too in memory, in the fragments that survive, in the questions their civilization still poses to ours. Are they so different, those ancient sleepers? They too lived their days, loved and feared and hoped, sought meaning in the face of mortality, tried to create something lasting from the temporary material of human life. Their answer was divine kingship, the belief that one person could embody cosmic order, could be simultaneously human and God, could maintain the fragile balance between chaos and civilization through a combination of ritual, authority, and genuine wisdom. We no longer believe this answer. We have found other ways to organize our societies, other frameworks for understanding power and legitimacy and the relationship between human and divine. But on a night like this, with stars overhead and silence all around, perhaps we can honor their attempt without needing to accept their conclusion. Perhaps we can recognize that they were doing what all humans do, creating meaning from mystery, building structures of belief and practice that made existence comprehensible and endurable, finding ways to connect the fleeting moment to something eternal. The pyramids stand in darkness now, their geometric perfection invisible until sunrise reveals them once more. But they are there, patient and permanent, or as permanent as anything can be, testament to the human capacity for extraordinary effort in service of transcendent purpose. Tomorrow, tourists will come and marvel, archaeologists will continue their patient work of uncovering and understanding, and the monuments will continue their slow journey toward dissolution. But tonight they sleep, and in their sleep, perhaps they dream the dreams of stones deep, slow dreams measured not in human lifetimes but in geological epochs, dreams that move at the pace of erosion and the shifting of deserts, dreams that are not really dreams at all but simply existence, the profound fact of being here, now, part of the great pattern that connects all things across time. We sleep too, you and I, our consciousness fading as we have traveled together through these 1,000 years of pharaonic history. The god-kings have receded into the distance, become shadows and whispers, their voices growing fainter as we drift deeper into our own night. Their world, so vivid and certain to them, has become to us a kind of dream, something we can visit but never truly inhabit. can study but never fully know, and perhaps our world, so vivid and certain to us, will someday seem the same to others, a distant dream, partially remembered, incompletely understood, poignant in its vanished certainty. The wheel turns, the river flows, the stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance, and civilizations rise and fall like breath, each believing itself the center of meaning, each ultimately becoming a story whispered in darkness, by voices that grow progressively fainter until they fade entirely into silence. But the silence is not empty. It is full of everything that was, everything that passed this way and left its trace. Every pharaoh who claimed divinity, every scribe who recorded their words, every farmer who trusted the flood would come, every child who heard stories of gods and kings and believed them true. All of this exists still, somehow, in the silence, not as literal presence, but as pattern, as echo, as the accumulated weight of all those vanished centuries pressing gently against the present dot. Rest now. The god-kings are sleeping. The pyramids keep their vigil under stars. The Nile flows as it has always flowed, carrying with it the memory of everything it has witnessed, all the history dissolved into its waters, moving steadily onward toward a sea that is itself moving, part of cycles larger than any human comprehension can encompass. Divine kingship has ended, but beauty remains. The tombs are empty, but wonder persists. The pharaohs are dust, but humanity continues its ancient work of creating meaning from mystery, building something from nothing, finding in the temporary materials of existence hints of patterns that transcend individual mortality. Sleep, then, as stones sleep, as rivers sleep while flowing, as civilizations sleep in their ruins, dreaming dreams we can no longer understand, speaking languages we have forgotten how to hear. Sleep as the pharaohs sleep, returned to the earth that bore them, their divine pretensions revealed as beautiful, temporary structures, their achievements neither permanent nor meaningless, but simply what they were: human beings doing extraordinary things, believing impossible beliefs, creating something magnificent from the simple fact of being alive and aware in a mysterious universe. The night deepens. The stars continue their slow wheeling, and somewhere in the eternal silence, the god-kings of Egypt rest in peace, their long work done, their divine authority relinquished, their humanity, which was always there beneath the ceremonial masks and sacred titles, finally allowed to return to dust and dream and the patient, gentle embrace of time that dissolves all things while somehow, mysteriously, preserving their essence in forms we can barely glimpse, but somehow, in moments like this, almost understand. Sleep well. The river flows. The stones remember. The ancient voices grow quiet now, fading into the vast silence that holds everything that ever was, everything that ever will be. The eternal now that exists beyond time, beyond history, beyond even the dreams of sleeping stones under infinite stars.